Summer Games Fest has revealed Resident Evil Requiem, the next mainline entry in its survival horror series, and for very good reason, people are more than a little excited about it. Though this year's Summer Games Fest showcase itself probably wasn't the best, RE Requiem's reveal was a highlight that did elevate the whole affair at least a little bit. Of course, there's still plenty that we don't know about the game yet, but based on what has officially been revealed, we've already got a wish list in our heads, as we're sure many other fans do as well. And here, that's exactly what we're going to talk about. New and familiar locations.
I need your eyes on the crime scene. The Renwood Hotel.
A new Resident Evil game would be something to be excited about regardless of anything else, but Resident Evil Requiem in particular has got series fans quite hyped for several reasons, chief among them being a return to Raccoon City. The iconic city was, of course, the setting for both Resident Evil 2 and 3, but the end of the latter saw it being nuked and entirely destroyed.
There it is.
Raccoon City has obviously continued to cast a narrative shadow over much of Resident Evil since then, but with Requiem, the series is actually physically going back. Our hope is to see a healthy mix of new and familiar locations. The game's reveal trailer showcases glimpses of the nuked out remains of the RPD building, and hopefully we'll see something similar to, say, the hospital or the orphanage, or hell, even the sewers. Returning to those locations years and years after the events of Resident Evil 2 and 3 and seeing how they've changed after the city was nuked is going to be fascinating. At the same time, we are, of course, also hoping to see plenty of new locations because we don't just want Requiem to be a post-nuclear trip down memory lane. Familiar monsters. Resident Evil has a knack for throwing terrifying and memorable foes at its audiences, so we are of course excited to learn more about what Requiem will have up its sleeve, especially since there's going to be plenty of new nightmarish creatures to square off against. We are, however, also hoping to see at least some familiar monsters. Given the fact that Requiem is taking us back to Raccoon City, we're hoping that it'll also bring back some familiar foes from around those parts. From Resident Evil 2's lickers and sewer monstrosities to Resident Evil 3's hunters and paleheads, there's a few enemy types we wouldn't mind running into again, and maybe they'll have even mutated and changed in all of the time that has passed. A stalker enemy.
Rocket launcher? Really?
Stalker enemies aren't always the easiest to pull off, but Resident Evil has usually had great success with them as a franchise, from Mr. X in Resident Evil 2 to Nemesis in the original RE3, and to a much lesser extent in the remake. From Jack Baker in Resident Evil 7 to Lady Dimitrescu in Resident Evil Village. Unsurprisingly then, we're desperately hoping for more of that with Resident Evil Requiem. Whether for a section of the game or for even the majority of the experience, we're hoping that Resident Evil Requiem chooses to heighten tension and make its scares that much more palatable by throwing a relentless and terrifying pursuer enemy into the mix. Follow up on old threads. With Resident Evil Requiem returning to Raccoon City, longtime fans of the series will of course be hoping that the game will pick up on some of those specific narrative threads. In fact, if anything, it kind of seems like a given that it will indeed do that. Given the fact that the city was nuked, it's probably easy to assume most of the people and things that were in it are gone, but that doesn't have to mean that there's no scope for interesting stories or tidbits nonetheless. For instance, what became of the Umbrella Lab, which was so deep underground after that nuke? Of the several side characters that we do meet in the city in RE2 and 3, were there any that managed to survive in ways that were never discovered? Even if it is just with Easter eggs or small bits of backstory, Requiem can tie back to RE2 and 3 in some really interesting ways. Ties to classic Resident Evil titles. Resident Evil Requiem has obvious ties to Resident Evil 2 and 3, as well as the Outbreak titles, since protagonist Grace Ashcroft is the daughter of Outbreak protagonist Alyssa. We are, however, hoping that the developer will continue to reveal further connections to the classic games in the series. Resident Evil is at its best when it keeps building on and iterating on its lore while also introducing new elements, as series fans will likely tell you. So there's hopefully stronger connections to RE2 and 3 waiting to be discovered. For instance, Resident Evil 6 revealed some crucial new narrative details related to Raccoon City's bombing. Could that come into play in Requiem once again, with the city once again becoming a part of the picture? A clearer view of the current timeline. The Resident Evil timeline has raised some interesting questions of late. Resident Evil Village ended with a scene set 16 years after the game's events, in the year 2037, or thereabouts, which is when the Shadows of Rose expansion is also taking place. But is that when we can expect Requiem to be placed in the timeline as well? The game's trailer says that protagonist Grace's mom died 8 years ago, and a note found in Resident Evil 7 says that she was still publicly active as a journalist until at least 2016, which means at most Requiem might be set in or around 2024. But that's not something that we have complete clarity on just yet, and hopefully we'll learn more about that in the not too distant future. FBI resources. Resident Evil Requiem protagonist Grace Ashcroft is confirmed to be an FBI agent, and we're hoping that'll reflect in the gameplay in some interesting ways. How exactly? Well, perhaps she has specific specialized tools and weapons in her arsenal provided to her by the FBI that you wouldn't have expected to have access to as someone like Ethan Winters. There's some interesting variation that unique gadgets or weapons could bring as far as exploration and combat are concerned. Continued focus on horror. One area where we're hoping Resident Evil Requiem doesn't make any compromises is the horror aspect. With an FBI agent for a protagonist, even if she doesn't seem to be a super soldier by any means, the game does run the risk of becoming too action-focused, or at least it does on paper. But this is a mistake the Resident Evil games have made before, so hopefully the series will know exactly what pitfalls to avoid. The developer does seem to be stressing an emphasis on horror in what we've seen of Requiem so far, so we're at least optimistic as things stand. Third-person gameplay. Resident Evil has oscillated between first and third-person gameplay in recent years, and it has, to be fair, seen spectacular success with both styles. With Requiem, however, we'd love for it to shift back to a third-person approach. As much as we do love first-person Resident Evil and want to get back to it at some point, we feel a third-person approach that evokes the likes of Resident Evil 2 and 3 would be particularly well suited for Resident Evil Requiem and what it seems like it's setting out to do.
And that'll be about it for this one. If you guys like what we're doing at Gaming Vault, please consider subscribing to our channel, and I'll see you guys on the next video.